Hey, what is going on, guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my opinion on the best AD carries for patch 5.20. So first up, I have Calista. Calista, I still think she's a great AD carry as long as you know how to use her passive and you can take advantage of her strong early game. She definitely does get outscaled by a lot of the other AD carries in the game, and her late game, it's not the best, that's for sure. You need to make sure that you're pairing her up with an aggressive support in the early game. Someone like a Leona or a Blitzcrank or a Braum, any support who can go aggressive in the early game, because if you don't take advantage of Calista's early game, then she is just going to get outscaled. So she's got a great level 6 all-in as well, and that's why I do like her with a strong engage support. Someone like a Braum is just so strong with Calista because her level 6 all-in is really good. She's also got free vision with her W, which is really nice for just spotting out the enemy jungler or just figuring out where the enemy jungler is starting at the beginning of the game. And her ultimate is pretty game changing as well. You can use that to find picks really nicely, especially if the enemy AD carry. For example, in the laning phase, like if the enemy support goes to ward and you're level 6, if the enemy AD carry just stays in lane, you can just pop your ultimate, kill the AD carry, and then just snowball the game from there. So I do think that Calista's ultimate is a very strong ability for just getting leads in the early game. And she does also have pretty good AoE damage once she does pick up the Runaan's Hurricane. If she can get some Ren stacks off in a team fight, then she can deal quite a bit of damage too. And she is also a really good kiting champion just due to her passive. And one con to Calista though is that she is harder to play. In my opinion, she's one of the harder AD carries in the game because her passive is very unique and it definitely does take some time to get used to. Next up, I have Tristana. Tristana is also really good when paired with a strong engage support. Her late game, unlike Calista's, is one of the best in the game, and once you do get to late game as Tristana, then the range that you have from your passive and just the amount of damage that you can do with the attack speed steroid on your Q with Tristana is really good, and she's just one of the best late game AD carries in the game. She's great with any engage support like a Leona or a Braum or a Thresh, because once you do hit level 6, Tristana's burst is really good, and if you can just get a Leona to engage at level 6, you can hop on the enemy AD carry and you can just burst them down really quickly. So I don't like Tristana paired up with a passive support like a Nami or someone like a Soraka, because you can't take advantage of her strong level 6 then. And she does also have the reset on her jump, which just makes her really hard to kill in teamfights. If she does get that first kill, then she can just keep jumping around and getting resets left, right, and center. So you don't want to let Tristana get that first kill or that first kill in a teamfight, because then she'll just end up going off. And she's one of the best, if not the best, tower pushing AD carries in the game. Her and Jinx are definitely the two of the best when it comes to tower pushing, just because Tristana's got her she's got her E, and then she's also got the attack speed steroid on her Q. And she's got the self-peel with her ultimate too, which just makes her a really safe AD carry. And like I said before, once you get to late game as Tristana, the range that you get with your passive just makes her really hard to pick out, and she can just sit back in a team fight from a long distance and just end up mowing the enemy team down. And a few cons to Tristana are that she does have a weaker mid game. She doesn't have the mid game like a Vayne or a Jinx, so you want to make sure that you are taking advantage of Tristana's pretty strong level 6 by going for an all-in at level 6 so that you don't get hit by that weak mid game. And she also, she isn't the best when paired up with someone like a Nami, like I said before, or someone who's really passive like a Soraka, because in the early game you can't really do too much with those champions, and once you do hit level 6 as Tristana, you really can't go for an all-in too well because you're not going to have any sort of engage. So I do really like Tristana paired up with an engage support instead of someone like a Soraka or Nami. So next up, I have Jinx. Jinx is one of those AD carries who really doesn't have a weak point in the game. Her early game is pretty good. She can poke the opponents down with her long range on her Q. Her mid game is also quite good, because if you can get a few AoE crits off from your auto attacks in team fights, then that can just easily win you a team fight right there. And then her late game is definitely one of the best in the game as well. So if you're just looking for a strong all-around AD carry, then Jinx is definitely a pretty strong pick right now. The big con to Jinx though, and one of the reasons why you probably wouldn't want to pick her, is that she's very immobile and she doesn't have a gap closer. So if you aren't very strong on immobile AD carries and you can't position well enough, then you probably don't want to pick up Jinx. You want to pick up an AD carry who who does have some sort of a dash, but if you know how to position well as AD carry, Jinx is definitely one of the best champions in the game when it comes to just dealing a load of AoE damage in team fights with her AoE damage coming out of her auto attacks. So she's got pretty good CC for an AD carry as well. Her W and her E provide some nice disengage or some nice self-peel for herself, and her ultimate is also pretty good for just picking off those low health enemies or just avoiding, or you can just look for a cross the map snipe on the opponent. Say if like your top lane goes for a duel, they get them really low, you can just use your ultimate up top lane and you can end up picking up some nice cross the map kills with Jinx's ultimate to end up snowballing the game. So that ability is just really versatile. She's also a great tower pusher. I think that Tristana does outclass Jinx a little bit when it comes to tower pushing, but she is definitely one of the stronger tower pushing AD carries in the game. She does have a lot of cleanup potential as well in teamfights due to her passive, and she's got pretty long range too with her fish bones. And a few cons to Jinx is that she does not have a gap closer, so if you can't position well as an AD carry, then Jinx probably isn't a very good choice for you. And she is also semi-skill shot reliant with her W and her ultimate, but I guess that's not the biggest con, because as long as you can position well in team fights as Jinx and get your damage off, then it doesn't really matter if you can land those abilities. So next up I have Vayne. I think that Vayne is definitely probably the best late game AD carry in the game. You could argue between Vayne and Jinx, but I think that if you're going for single target damage, Vayne definitely does outclass pretty much any other AD carry in the game, just because of the true damage she can get off, and you can just carry a team fight super hard late game as Vayne as long as you know how to position correctly. And she's a great pick against enemy tanks. She's just a pretty strong pick no matter what meta it is, because her late game is so good. She does have a little bit of a weaker early game though, so you have to be careful that you're not getting killed in the early game, because then you can end up being pretty useless in the mid game. So just go a little bit more passive in the early game unless you really know what you're doing on Jinx. You can definitely get some kills in the laning phase as her. I'm not saying that she's a really weak laning AD carry, but she is definitely not as strong as some of the other AD carries when it comes to the laning phase. She's got the gap closer on her Q2, which just allows her to stay really mobile in team fights, and she does have a very strong 1v1 as well, especially if she can land that condemn. Her true damage just makes her really strong late game, and it just makes her a great pick against tanks as well. And the stealth with her ultimate is one of the most underrated parts of her kit, I think, because it just makes her really hard to target in team fights. So a few cons to Vayne are that she's shorter range, so she does have a little bit of a weaker time in the laning phase against long-ranged AD carries like Caitlyn and Ashe. And in my opinion, she is harder to play. I think there's a pretty big difference between a great Vayne player and an average Vayne player. Whenever I can really pick out the difference between like a great Vayne player and an average Vayne player, because what an average Vayne will do is she'll always like use her tumble incorrectly. She'll tumble forward and she'll just try to end up She'll try to be the hero in every single team fight, and she'll try to like 1v5 and just end up carrying every single team fight. Whereas a great Vayne player, she'll know when to go in, she'll know when to tumble, she won't be like super aggressive. So I think that if you don't know how to play Vayne correctly and you just end up using your tumble and your condemn in the wrong situation, then she isn't the best AD carry in the game. But if you can get to late game as Vayne, I guess it doesn't really matter how good of an AD carry you are, because as long as you can position decently in team fights as Vayne, then you can just put out so much DPS in team fights that I guess it doesn't really matter how good your positioning is. So to round out the top 5 for this patch, I have Mordekaiser. I still think that Mordekaiser is definitely one of the strongest AD carries in the game. You can argue that Vayne and Jinx are better than Mordekaiser, but I think that if you pair Mord up with a strong aggressive support in the early game like a Tahm Kench or a Thresh or a Blitzcrank, you can end up snowballing the early game so hard that you can just end up getting Dragon, you can take towers all across the map, and you can just end up basically ending the game before the 25-minute point. That's how strong Mordekaiser is. So I really don't like him though if your support locks in someone like a Janna or a Nami or a Sona, because then you can't go aggressive in the early game as Mordekaiser, and I think that he's kind of useless unless you do pair him up with an aggressive support. So if your team locks Mordekaiser, like if your AD carry locks Mordekaiser, just don't pick someone like a Janna, or don't pick a passive support in the laning phase, because his early game is just so strong. And if you can land that one hook in the laning phase, or you can get that tongue lash off from Tahm Kench, then you can just end up zoning the enemies from CS, because Mordekaiser is going to get the solo XP in the laning phase. So as long as you can get like a little bit of a lead, you can just end up zoning the opponents to the point where they won't even be able to move into experience range. And then once Mordekaiser hits level 6, he can all in so easily that the enemy, unless you're like a really bad Mordekaiser player, then you're going to be able to win every level 6 all-in on him, because his level 6 all-in is just so good with the amount of damage he's got. So I think that he's just an all-around great AD carry as long as you do pair him up with an aggressive support. He can also get pretty tanky in the late game because he doesn't need to go full damage like most of the other AD carries have to do, and he does also scale with AD and AP, which is pretty nice. However, I do think that building AP Mordekaiser is better now since the AP ratio on his W did get buffed. And a few cons to Mordekaiser is that he does not have a gap closer, so he can get picked off in team fights. That's why I really like Mordekaiser paired with Tahm Kench, because it's really hard to obviously pick off Mordekaiser if you got Tahm Kench on your team, because he can just eat you and save you whenever you do get engaged on. So I do think that if you don't like get ahead in the early game though, and you can't keep engaging on your opponents, then he is a little bit weaker since he does not have some sort of gap closer. And he, like I said before, he is pretty weak if he's paired with a passive support. First up on the honorable mentions, I have Sivir. I still think that Sivir is a great pick for solo queue. Her ultimate is one of the best ultimates in the game for solo queue because it can just be used in so many different situations. You can use it to engage, to disengage, you can use it to pick enemies off, and she also does have a pretty strong laning phase as well. She's got pretty good poke with her Q, and her wave clear is like some of the best in the game. She probably does have the best wave clear in the game for any AD carry due to her W and her Q. So if you're lacking wave clear on your team, then Sivir is definitely a very good pick to just allow your team to not get sieged on really easily. For example, if your mid lane locks someone like a Kassadin, and then your top lane locks in someone who like a Fiora who doesn't have strong wave clear, then picking Sivir as your AD carry is a pretty good choice. Next up, I have Draven. Draven is one of the highest DPS AD carries in the game, especially once you do get to that late game. He can just deal so much damage with his Q. He is a little bit harder to play, and he also does not have a gap closer, so he can get picked off pretty easily in team fights, especially if he is like focusing on catching all of his Qs. It can be pretty easy for someone like a Leona just to pop her ultimate right on where the Draven Q is going to land and then just burst him down really quickly. So I think that if you know how to play Draven correctly, then you can do really well on him, but he is definitely a little bit harder to play than some of the other AD carries. So next up on the honorable mentions, I have Ashe. I still think that Ashe is a pretty good pick for solo queue. Her ultimate is really game changing, and if you can hit that on the enemy mid or AD carry in a team fight, then you could just end up winning the game for your team. The main reason why I don't like her so much as I did before, or the main reason why she's not on my top 5 is basically because she doesn't have any sort of gap closer or any movement speed buff, so it's just really easy to get picked off in a team fight as Ashe. And whenever I'm playing her, I find myself like getting second or third item QSS because I'm just not very confident in my positioning as Ashe, and I just find myself getting caught out by something like a Thresh Hook or a Leona ult in a team fight. So I think that if you can position well as Ashe and you have someone like a Tahm Kench or a Janna who can keep you safe, then she is a pretty good AD carry, but she definitely is a little bit more risky just due to the fact that she doesn't have a dash or a movement speed buff in her kit. So to round out the honorable mentions for this patch, I have Caitlyn. Caitlyn is one of the strongest early game AD carries in the game, and I think that the only reason why you would want to play her is because of her strong early game. She's got a pretty weak mid game, and then she does ramp up in the late game again, but I think that you really need to take advantage of Caitlyn's early game for her to be successful. She's a great pick into someone like a Vayne or a Sivir or any AD carry who's got lower range because she can poke them down and just end up zoning them from CS. So I think that if you know how to play Caitlyn and you can take advantage of her long range, she can be a great pick for solo queue, but she isn't as strong as the champions on my top 5 in my opinion, because if you can't take advantage of her strong early game, then she does have a weaker mid game spike. And that is all for the video, guys. If you enjoyed, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you have not already. So thanks for watching, guys. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.